Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. It always appalls me when a senseless tragedy that has resulted in the loss of innocent lives is exploited by some politicians and some members of the mainstream media to advance ulterior motives, to bolster political agendas that would not have been viable otherwise. Unfortunately, the Sandy Hook Elementary School massacre in Connecticut has had this effect. This horrendous massacre has given ammunition to the gun control proponents who would wish to deprive millions of law-abiding Americans who had nothing to do with this terrible shooting of their right to keep and bear arms. These individuals may keep those weapons purely for self-defense, to protect themselves and their homes against criminal intruders, or because they engage in certain sports like marksmanship, or because they collect firearms out of historical interest, or because they are of the same mind as many of the American founding fathers who believed that an armed populace is one of the most potent deterrents against tyranny ever arising in the first place. All of these are peaceful individuals who would not commit criminal acts, and yet the actions of one deranged person, Adam Lanza, are being used to justify depriving them of their liberty. Of course, there are other agendas that have tried to ride the Sandy Hook bandwagon. On the religious right, Mike Huckabee has stated that the reason why the massacre occurred is because God has been taken out of the schools. And of course, this maligns anyone who doesn't agree with Huckabee's particular brand of Christianity, and not only that, it even maligns those Christians who don't believe that public government-funded schools are the place to advance their religion. And of course, with mass shootings like this, there comes about the widespread denunciation of video games and computer games, and this is a problem for both the political left and the political right in the United States. Again, maligning tens of millions of completely peaceful gamers who do not associate the events on a computer screen or a television screen with real life, who do not see any connection between shooting fictional monsters and shooting real people, who can distinguish between fiction and reality. And behind every one of these proposals is a desire to suppress the liberties of the innocent, the peaceful, the law-abiding. And I find it unconscionable that the murder of children would be used in this way, especially because in many cases a tragedy is just that. It's a tragedy. And certainly what happened in Sandy Hook was absolutely horrific. But so many innocent people die in so many terrible ways without having deserved it one bit. And not every one of these deaths requires a political response. And certainly none of these deaths would require that an innocent person who has not harmed anyone be deprived of liberty or property. Now, it is fitting, I think, to step back and consider how horrible massacres like this one arise. And I think the sensationalism of the mainstream media has a great deal to do with it. Because when an event like this is given such dramatic 24-hour nationwide news coverage, it invites every single person who would consider committing an act like this to see this as a path to prominence, to visibility, to attention that these people would not have otherwise gotten. Consider that the Sandy Hook shooting took place just a few days after a similarly tragic Oregon mall shooting. Consider that in the vast majority of these cases, the shooters kill themselves after they perpetrate their murders. It seems to me that these types of mass killings are a very public form of suicide for a certain type of deranged individual. And these deranged persons, if they didn't anticipate so much attention being paid to them and their acts, after they perpetrated them. They might have just killed themselves quietly. The key here is that the media, in sensationalizing these types of events, in emphasizing them disproportionately, in spreading the news coverage to a worldwide audience as opposed to concentrating on the local area and on spreading factual information to the people affected, the media make possible a climate where this becomes a modus operandi of a certain kind of deranged person. Now, in many ways, the media do not convey an accurate picture of what is actually happening in the world, because the predominant focus is on negativity. For instance, in the United States, since the mid-1990s, crime rates of all sorts have declined remarkably, and that includes rates of violent homicide. In 2010, in the United States, the per capita rate of violent homicide was as low as it had been in 1961. And, ladies and gentlemen, this decline has continued. There continue to be murders. Indeed, every single day someone is murdered in a major American city. But statistically, there are fewer murders today than there used to be 15 years ago. But do we see this fact being given 24-hour news coverage by the mainstream media? Do we see the mainstream media telling us in very minute detail about all the ways in which life has actually improved dramatically for large swaths of the human population? We don't see that. We see a constant drumbeat of negativity, a constant focus on the most gruesome, the most tragic, the most unconscionable events in the world. And it is true that these events do happen every single day. In so many places throughout the world, innocent people lose their lives in terrible ways. But focusing solely on that does not give us a true and complete picture. And furthermore, focusing solely on those kinds of tragedies will invite additional tragedies, because it only takes a few deranged people to take this news coverage in the type of perverse way that I described. And ladies and gentlemen, we see, especially in this event, how often the mainstream media can get the truth terribly wrong. Because when news of the Sandy Hook massacre initially broke out, it was not the true shooter Adam Lanza who was identified, but rather his brother, Ryan Lanza, who had nothing to do with it. Worse yet, there was another Ryan Lanza, completely unrelated to Adam Lanza or the entire situation. And some completely incompetent reporters found his Facebook profile and took his picture from that Facebook profile and broadcast it worldwide, resulting in this completely extraneous Ryan Lanza receiving streams of vitriolic posts and hate mails and having his life and reputation essentially ruined by this media circus. And ladies and gentlemen, do you think that this completely innocent, extraneous Ryan Lanza is going to get his just recompense for the smear job that the mainstream media did on him? I really hope that he does get his just compensation, but somehow I doubt that the mainstream media will pay him the kind of reparations that he deserves. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is completely unconscionable to have the murder of children be taken advantage of in this way by politicians seeking to advance ulterior agendas, by mainstream media who just see this as part of a 24-hour news cycle, who just see this as the next event to grab the attention of their viewers and keep them distracted from more constructive pursuits, like actually trying to improve their lives and make the world a better place, a place in which tragedies like these would not need to occur. For me, it is particularly unconscionable when a large group of completely innocent and peaceful and law-abiding individuals get maligned and harmed because of this kind of sensationalism and this kind of politicking. With the gun control agenda, this is particularly prominent and particularly troubling, because the gun control agenda was largely politically unviable in recent years, up until this very dramatic and over-sensationalized event. There were some legislative attempts to limit firearm ownership. The 1994 Brady assault weapons ban was one example. There were many local and state-level restrictions as well. In fact, Connecticut, at the time of the Sandy Hook massacre, was one of the most restrictive in the country when it came to firearm ownership. And still, this massacre happened. There have been Supreme Court decisions in the 2000s, most notably the famous Heller decision, which reaffirmed the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms. And it's very clear from the language of the Second Amendment that, yes, indeed, it does say that the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed, and the Supreme Court justices agreed with this. So it seemed up until now that the gun control issue was not going to get much political traction, and then it got resurrected because children were murdered. And I think it's completely unacceptable that this is used as a lifeline. The death of children is used as a lifeline for an agenda. Now, what's even worse is that some people went out of their way to demonize anyone who disagreed with the gun control agenda. Even I, on a previous video of mine on the follies of gun control, on the day of the Sandy Hook massacre, got a vitriolic comment from some individual stating that I somehow had blood on my hands because I opposed gun control. Well, at the time I saw that comment, which I subsequently deleted, I wasn't even very well aware of what had happened in Sandy Hook. It was too recent. And yet, people who simply have different viewpoints, people who don't see a particular kind of law as the solution, are being classed in with criminals by those who are unscrupulous enough to advance their agenda by any means they think will fly in a particular climate of outrage. Ladies and gentlemen, it is time to use reason, and it is time to consider that some problems are less tractable than could be solved by a simple ban of whatever is considered a bad thing, or a precursor to a bad thing. Consider that some people don't care about laws, and don't care about prohibitions, and don't care about restrictions. Someone like Adam Lanza certainly would not have been deterred by a ban on firearms. Indeed, virtually all elementary schools in the United States, virtually all institutions of public education more generally, are so-called gun-free zones, where one cannot bring a gun. Did that deter any school shooter from bringing a gun into those areas? No. Ladies and gentlemen, when there is a law that prohibits a certain action, the only people who are going to respect that law are people who are generally law-abiding and people who are peaceful. People who do care about prohibitions on heinous acts. In fact, murder is illegal right now. The people who commit murder violate the prohibition on murder. So how is it that setting more prohibitions is going to solve the problem? It isn't. It's only going to make the law-abiding individuals disarmed and more likely to fall victim to criminals, whether they be cold calculating criminals, such as mafia gangsters, or deranged, hot-headed, suicidal criminals, like the many mass shooters throughout history. There is not going to be that kind of simple solution. The solution to these kinds of problems is a lot more intricate, a lot more complex. The growth of science and technology and general human prosperity has had the effect of reducing crime rates, and I'm hoping that that will continue. The better people's lives are, not just materially, but also emotionally and intellectually. The more they feel they have something to live for, the less likely they are going to commit crime. Furthermore, if the sensationalism of the media dies down, if the media begin to take a more reasoned approach, a more proportionate approach, then we might see fewer other shootings be motivated by dramatic coverage of previous shootings. We might start seeing individuals trying to resolve issues about which they have more local knowledge, what Friedrich Hayek called the knowledge of time and place. Surely someone in Adam Lanza's community who knew of his situation would have been more suited to offer a functional solution than a legislator in Washington, D.C., who would try to simply limit millions of peaceful, law-abiding Americans' prerogatives because of this terrible event. And sometimes, ladies and gentlemen, the only thing we can do when it comes to a tragedy like this is more. Because if the perpetrator is dead, there is no more person on whom justice can be brought. It's over. The victims are dead and the perpetrator is dead. And it's an all-around terrible, saddening, horrifying event. But let's not use it as political ammunition. Instead, let us find ways to live in a more just, peaceful, and prosperous society, and to reason civilly about issues instead of demagoguery and condemnation of the other. Thank you very much.